How to paint more neatly, that's what we're going to look at in today's video. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolor, as well as drawing, some mixed media, even some business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new upload for you. Make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. Now, I know some of you get frustrated when you can't paint as neatly as you would like to paint on occasions. You end up with scruffy edges, smudges, that sort of thing. Today I've got 9 tips for you that are going to help you to paint more neatly, and none of them require actual improvement of motor skills. So these are all simple things, but if you do these things, you're going to find that you can paint a lot more neatly than you could before. So let's get started with tip number 1. So the first way I have for you to paint more neatly is to support your wrist. Let me show you what I mean and how it's done. So have you ever seen pictures of oil painters and those long sticks that they use with the padded end, and they're kind of resting their arm against it? This is for a reason, and the reason is that if you support your wrist, your hand will shake less. So we all get shakier hands as we get older. Mine are certainly not as steady as they were when I was young. And so if you're working sort of up like this and you're holding your hand up in the air, your hand is going to shake more. So you need to support your wrist either just by resting it on the paper, or perhaps if there's something wet, you may need to support your wrist like this. If you've got wet paint somewhere, then you're going to need to lean perhaps on a piece of paper towel. Make sure that your paint isn't soaking wet when you do that, as that will leave a mark as well. But if you've just got something you don't want to smudge, maybe it's even just some pencil that you've been drawing with, put some paper towel down and then you can rest your wrist. Painting like this and having your fingers closer to the end of the brush will give you a neater effect, and you'll shake less than if you're holding the paintbrush from the end like this and holding it up in the air. You'll be a lot more shaky. My next tip sounds obvious, but you would be amazed how many people don't do it. That's to make sure that you can always see the tip of your brush. So one thing I've often seen my students do when they're painting is they're kind of, and if you imagine I'm sitting this side and this is away from me, so if my brush is here, it's blocking my view over here. So I see people, instead of being able to see what they're doing, they're kind of prodding at something from the wrong side and they can't actually see the tip of their brush, when all they need to do really is turn their paper round so they can see where the tip of the brush is. How on earth can you paint neatly if you can't see the end of your brush? For tip number 3, you need to be using the right amount of water. We're going to look at this in several tips today because this varies from person to person. Some people paint too wet, some people paint too dry. It even makes a difference how much paint pigment to water ratio you have. First of all, we're going to look at the idea of painting with your brush too dry. This will lead to paper skipping. Let me show you how much paint you really need on your brush. Now I've got a really dry brush here and some thick paint just to exaggerate this, but often people don't use enough paint. What happens then is their paintbrush skips over the surface of the paper and misses the little dips, and so we don't get any smoothness to the paint because it's not traveling into those little dips. And this is an incredibly smooth paper I'm on here. It's just a practice paper, so you can imagine that on a really nice quality paper with lots of dips in, it's going to be even worse. Now this is a technique in its own right. It's called dry brush, but so many people get it when they don't want it. So all you have to do is make sure there's enough water on your brush that when it goes along, it goes into all of those little dips and you're getting a nice, smooth, neat effect. For my next tip, I'm going to show you how to paint along an edge rather than sort of prodding at it sideways. A professional artist I know of calls these fluffy edges. Let's look at how to avoid them. So this one speaks about edges. Now I'm going to draw an edge just in a ballpoint pen here. This would normally be pencil, of course, in your picture. Now so many people I see trying to paint up to an edge like this, and they're doing something like this, and they're going up to the edge like this. You've got no chance of getting this neat. You need to be going along your edge. So let's draw another one, and you need to be going level with that edge and traveling down it, not trying to paint at it sideways. I think sometimes this is just simple laziness, and again, as in the first example, you need sometimes just to turn your paper around so that you can access things properly. Now, I'm pretty good at painting accurately. When I have trouble with this, it's usually due to one thing only, and that's that my brush is in a mess. It hasn't got a very good point. The ends are all splayed out. It makes it impossible to paint accurately, even if you're naturally neat like I am. Let me give you a few tips on brush care. Now, if I asked you to guess which one of these brushes would paint most neatly, it wouldn't be rocket science. I wouldn't expect anyone to get the answer wrong. This is a really old brush. Now, you should never throw an old brush away. They're good for all sorts of things, particularly when you need to scrub at something. You don't want to use your best brush, or when you're using some kind of mixed media or acrylic paint. Again, you don't want to mess up your best brush. But obviously, when you're doing some neat painting, you're going to need a brush with a nice point on it. So what you want to do is, after you finish using your brushes, and never ever stand them in the water jar, not for any length of time, certainly not watercolor brushes anyway. You may have to do that a little bit with acrylic brushes, but they've got stiffer bristles. So never stand your brush in the water jar, because you're going to bend it, even if it just bends the tip. What you want to do is, as soon as you finish painting for the day, is you want to rinse your brush thoroughly. Now, don't be afraid to bash the brush on the bottom of the water jar. So a lot of people, they're very worried about damaging the brush, and so they don't clean it properly. But that in itself causes problems, because if you don't get all the paint out of it, it's going to be going up here into this part here. The little pigments will dry inside the ferrule. As it dries, the bristles will splay out. So don't be afraid of bashing it a little bit, being a bit vigorous with it. As long as it's only for a second or two, you'll be fine. I would actually wash this in some liquid hand soap or a specialist brush cleaner with some warm water, give it a good rinse, and then once you've rinsed it thoroughly and cleaned it thoroughly, as I have not incidentally with this one, but you know the process, you can imagine. What you're going to do then is dry your brush like this, and you want to shape your brush back into the shape that it originally was. This may be a point, it may be flat, so if it's flat, you're going to shape it like this. Get it back as close as possible to the correct brush shape, and then you're going to lay it flat like this to dry, maybe on something like a sunny windowsill. If you want to, you can suspend it by some kind of brush holder, or I've even just used an elastic band and sort of tied it around a window handle, and you can suspend it up in the air, bristles down if you want to. That's just as good. What you don't want to do is dry it upright in a jar like this. So you don't want to have it bristles up when it's drying. That's because any residue that happens to be left will go down, 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 and it'll all start to build up in here. And as it builds up, it's going to take up space. That space is then going to mean that your bristles are going to splay outwards. So look after your brushes. If you're having trouble painting neatly, take a look at the brush you're using. A synthetic brush like this is incredibly cheap. There are links to some in the video description. You should make sure that you've always got at least one nice brush for painting with. You can keep the older ones for the scruffy work. At this point in the video, can I ask, if you're enjoying this video and getting some value from it, can you please click that thumbs up, that like button for me? You'll believe how it helps me with the YouTube algorithm. If you can like, share, subscribe, it's free, or leave me a comment, that'll help YouTube to push this video out to more people. I can help more people to paint and draw. It really helps me if you share the video too. So if you know somebody else that would find it useful, you can send it to them via Messenger, or maybe share it in an art group. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers, thanks to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. Now, when you have a large area to go around, you may be loath to use masking fluid, because we all know that if you put masking fluid on large amounts of your paper, great big swathes of your paper, I say we all know that, but I see people do it all the time, so obviously not everybody knows it, but don't do this. You may be thinking to yourself, well, I've got no option, I can't use masking fluid for this area, it's too big, I'm just going to have to paint around it. If my hands shake, I might mess this up. I've got a trick where you can use less masking fluid, but still help yourself to get that edge nice and crisp. So I've got a large round shape here. I don't want to paint over it. Maybe it's something like a sun or a moon, and I want to put a lot of wet paint around the outside. I can't put masking fluid over the whole thing because it would likely tear my paper, but I know that as I'm trying to fill in this big space, I'm going to have to be quick so I don't get drying lines, and how am I going to paint neatly around that and be quick with all that other paint? So there is a compromise, and what you can do is you can just take your masking fluid and just mask just inside here. And what this will do is it's just going to help you paint a little bit more neatly. You'll be able to take that paint up to the edge of this area. And it's just going to almost contain your paint. So you haven't masked out the whole area, but you've got a nice rim around the outside. It's just going to stop you from making that tiny little error where you go into that area. You can also do this with things like horizon lines or buildings. Maybe you've got a flat horizon line like this and you just don't want to get any sky down here in your foreground. Then all you have to do really is take your masking fluid just along that edge. So once I've got that masking fluid on the edge there, it's going to protect that edge, and it means that I can paint areas nice and quickly and go close to the edge and not worry too much that I'm going to go over the area that I'm trying to protect. Then all I've got to do is wait until that's dry and remove the masking fluid. Works for landscapes, works for buildings, works for any area where you just need that neat edge and yet you know you have to paint up to it pretty quickly. Have you ever tried to paint with really watery paint when you want those very pale colours and you feel like you just can't control it, and it's splashing everywhere, you're making lots of splatters? It's not your imagination. There's an actual reason for this that has to do with water surface tension and binders and physics. Let's look next at how the amount of pigment to water ratio you have can help you to paint more neatly. Of course, you can't always avoid using those very watered down colours, but it's just something that you can be aware of if it's an option for you. Let's look at that next. So if you've ever mixed a really pale colour with lots of water like this and you've been painting with it and it's almost seemed quite hard to keep it in place, and you notice that sometimes it can splatter easily and you just don't seem to paint as neatly as you normally do, it's not your imagination. You're fighting against a whole lot of surface tension here. Now, it can't always be avoided, but if you have to use paint this wet, then what you want to do is paint quite slowly with it because it does splatter more easily. The more pigment that you have mixed in, the more you've got things like binders in there and glues, and they're going to help you to paint more neatly. As I said, that's not something that can always be avoided if you need a really watery colour, but just something to be aware of. If you've got an area where you need to be especially neat, you're not going to be able to paint a very watery colour as neatly as a colour with more pigment in. And that's because what you're painting with here is mostly water, and you've got a whole load of surface tension that you're fighting with the brush. So next up, I have a couple of almost lifestyle tips for you. And the first tip that I have for you is don't paint in bad light. Now, years ago, I used to run an art class. In fact, I started running art classes originally for children. Then I moved on to doing adults art classes, and I used to run them in a local cafe on a Tuesday evening. Now, in the UK, it can get dark in the winter at as early as 4 p.m. It's really murky, had all the spotlights with multiple lights everywhere. And people who take art classes tend to be a little bit older, sometimes retired, and the bad light used to play havoc with our eyes. So if you are having difficulties with neat painting, make sure that you paint during the daytime. A lot of people like those daylight bulbs as well. Personally, I've never got on with them, but it's certainly something to try. You could also use one of those magnifying lenses. Anything that you can do to get the light and the way that you're seeing your work a little bit better. Another lifestyle tip I have for you is try not to paint when you're really tired or feeling a bit under the weather. You might think to yourself, well, I can manage, painting's relaxing, but actually anything we do that requires concentration, we need to be fairly fresh, and your eyes are actually physically affected. Things happen to the lenses, stuff goes out of focus, particularly if you've been staring at something for a long time. So don't paint when you're tired, and also take regular breaks. If you're staring at something really close up for ages, you're going to find that it's going to affect your vision, and this gets worse and worse the older we get. So if you've been painting close up for a long time and you're feeling tired, have a break. The best thing you can do for your eyes is actually to look at things a long way in the distance. If you've been working up close, maybe go for a walk, just let your eyes focus on things that are a long way away. Have that rest before you go back to your painting. So do let me know in the comments if you found any of these tips useful. Perhaps you have some tips of your own to share with other people reading the comments, things that help you to paint more neatly. Don't forget to have a look in the video description before you leave this video. You can find out all about my online courses, the paint sets that I designed, my Patreon subscription membership. There are also free downloadable PDFs that you can grab, and there's even a free art course you can take. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also enjoy the next video I have for you. You can watch that one right now.